primary passage for today, the beginning of Holy Week, Jesus entering on what we call Palm Sunday into Jerusalem to celebrate the feast of the Passover. This was such a momentous occasion. Virtually every Jew who would come to the city of Jerusalem for these series of days to make this major pilgrimage. They would travel from all over the Roman and Greek diaspora, North Africa, Italy, as far as England for that matter, to try and come to Jerusalem for this celebration. So the city, which was normally a relatively small city, suddenly became literally 10 to 15 times its normal size, filled with all of these pilgrims. It reminds me very much of Venice. If you've ever been to Venice, you may or may not know, but most Venetians actually don't live in Venice. And Venice's population, again, is millions of times more because of the number of tourists who visit it each year. And in fact, they're actually considering putting a limit on it because of the wear and tear on the city. And so in Jesus' time, all of the Jewish pilgrims from around the known world would travel to Jerusalem. They would gather there, and there was a lot of concern and apprehension. Now, have you ever had an experience in life where you thought something was going to be one thing and it turned out to be another? Sometimes good, sometimes bad. Have you ever gone to an occasion where you expected it? It might be actually a little bit of being in a restaurant. How many of you had this experience? Sitting in a restaurant and you see someone across a restaurant do this. And you don't recognize them. And on occasion, I feel a little self-conscious, so you think, well, maybe I should recognize them, so you kind of wave back and smile. Then you realize that they're actually waving to the people behind you at the next table. In other words, something you expected wasn't quite what it seemed to be. That's exactly what's happening in Jerusalem for the Passover feast. There are so many different groups of these pilgrims coming together, each with their own expectation about what's going to happen in the Passover. You had, for example, the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the political religious party heavily aligned with Hellenistic culture, introduced by Alexander the Great and the Ptolemies to large parts of the world. The Greek language, Greek theater, Greek ways of democracy, quite a wide range of things were introduced. And they adopted a number of the practices. They felt quite at home with the prevailing culture. Even polytheism, although not directly accepted, was tolerated. They thought you've got to play along to get along. And because the Sadducees controlled the temple worship, they were primarily the priests of the temple and had a big say in that. They were most interested in making sure that when all these hundreds of thousands of pilgrims came into Jerusalem, that there weren't going to be problems. Because problems creates all sorts of things they don't want. For example, all of the pilgrims are bringing temple offerings. It brings a lot of money in for the necessary worship that takes place in the temple and the well-being of the leadership there. And so the last thing you want is civil disobedience. Can you imagine all of the store owners on the Champs-Élysées in Paris every time people with yellow jackets show up? Because they've been going around smashing all the store windows of all those elite stores in Paris and really affecting tourism to one of the second, I'm told, most popular tourist destination in the world. Number one is London, England. Yes, interesting. Number two, apparently, Paris, France. But there's a lot of money involved. If tourists don't come to your store and spend their money, it's a big economic hit. So the Sadducees worked with the Romans. They tolerated the Romans. At least they provide some stable stability so that worship can take place and economic dealings can take place. The second group were the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the religious political party, often with the smaller towns outside of Jerusalem. They had a very strong belief in practicing all of the law to the nth degree. They thought that by the closer you paid attention to the practice of the law, the closer you drew to God. And so they were very concerned when people did things that were out of the norm and could could be interpreted as being offending the law. For example, how far can you go on the Sabbath day? What's work on the Sabbath? Can you heal someone on the Sabbath? Can you raise them from the dead on the Sabbath? Is this work? And they were highly critical often, although a number of Pharisees did follow Jesus. So it's not just negative on the Pharisees. Many of them really desired to draw close to God. They were seeking God's kingdom. The third group that you're going to find in this crowd of pilgrims are the Zealots. Now, the Zealots hated the Romans, and they looked forward to fermenting civil revolt in order to reestablish Jewish independence. The last time they looked back to about 200 years earlier to the Maccabees, who fought Antiochus Epiphanes, one of the descendants of Alexander the Great, who controlled that part of Syria and Israel. And they won independence after Antiochus Epiphanes defiled the temple by sacrificing a pig on the high altar and introducing idols to the temple. And so the Maccabees rose up, and as a sign of their success, they minted their first coins, which had palm branches on them, which were symbols of Jewish independence, religious and political freedom. And so when people wave palm branches, it's not just because they want shade. It's a sign of, we want freedom. We want freedom. We want God to save us. We want to be set free politically and religiously. We want to return to the Maccabees. In the modern context, if you were an American, it might be similar to Americans throwing tea bags into the water 200 years after the Boston Tea Party. You know your American history. That was one of the key events in the fight against taxation without representation. I'm throwing you back to high school. So in one sense, if Americans went forward, and it is interesting because one of the American political parties is called the what? The Tea Party, harking back to no taxation without representation, freedom of the people. Even though the event is 200 years earlier, it's still very current today. That would have been the feeling for the Zealots. We want to be free. We want to rise up against the Romans. And we want to create situations where there is revolt and revolution. There were other groups. There were the Herodians, who supported the status quo, King Herod's party, and supported the Romans. You had people who were truly despondent, the heavy taxation. Some scholars have said it was higher than 90% of what you made went in taxes. Can you imagine that? And you're not benefiting from the taxes. And the food's coming out of your family's mouths. And so there would have been desperation. There would have been people who were saying, God, where are you? We've been faithful to you, but it seems that the kingdom is not coming. And then they heard about Jesus. He raised people from the dead. He healed people. He spoke of God's coming kingdom. Could this be the leader, the one we've been waiting for? And so as Jesus enters Jerusalem, coming in on a donkey. Now the Romans would have rode in on a war horse, symbol of power and military strength. Jesus chose the foal of a donkey, similar to King David when he entered Jerusalem, as a sign of humility. You're coming into God's presence as one of the worshipers, not as the conqueror, with humility, carrying the good news of the gospel. Now, we've talked about those groups. What about the disciples? What were they thinking about? We know from the argument which Doug just read, which you'll hear on Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday, the disciples then and before were arguing about who's greatest. Who's going to be number one in the group? What are they thinking about? In spite of the fact that Jesus has said to them, I'm going to Jerusalem, and when I go to Jerusalem, I'm going to be rejected and put to death, and then on the third day, rise again. Now, my suspicion is that the disciples had no idea what to do with that. Who rises from the dead? They've seen Lazarus resurrected, but someone resurrecting themselves? Dying? And so they're going in with a spirit of confusion and competition. it's interesting that the people who really see who Jesus is and understand his ministry are hinted at in the passages that just precede this one. So, for example, you have Zacchaeus in Jericho, the hated tax collector who everybody wants to put a knife in his back. But because he invites Jesus to come to his house for dinner, and Jesus invites himself, there is healing and forgiveness. It's the person who's open to God doing something in their lives that Jesus says is the one who's going to really see the kingdom of God come. And it starts in our hearts. And the next story is of the blind beggar, who everyone considers least of all. You're disabled, you're useless, you're beside the street begging for money just to survive. And in fact, some even thought that beggars, people who are blind, you were blind because your parents or you had done something so evil that God had cursed you with blindness. In other words, you got what you deserve. Can you imagine that, living with that? And it's that person who shows faith by coming to Jesus for healing. And Luke puts that story there as well to say, in spite of the spiritual blindness of those in Jerusalem, it is the people with the eyes of faith, the blind, who actually seek Jesus, who receive the blessing. And so Jesus is going into Jerusalem. We start this journey in Holy Week with all of these different expectations. And the disciples are going to be most challenged, as we are, to trust God that in spite of how everything looks, God's promises are going to be fulfilled. You know, every time I celebrate a funeral, I use the word celebrate, this is the point that's exactly made. At a Christian funeral, the person is dead. They're gone. But we know that's not the end of the story. We have the hope of the resurrection through our faith in Christ. Funerals present us with this reality of trusting God in spite of how things look, that that's not the end. And so we're going to hear about trusting God in this week and walking with Jesus. And as disciples are about to discover in even the smallest things, such as trusting God when he gives you, or Jesus when he gives you instructions, trust me. Let's hear a bit of a story about that.
This is a no-brainer. We do exactly what Jesus said. We go into town, we find the donkey with its coat,
I just don't understand why Jesus wants us to commit a crime. He wants us to steal a donkey.
No, not steal, borrow.
Oh, so we're just supposed to stroll into town, untie the donkey,
and say exactly what he said to say.
What is it? Oh, that the Lord has need of it?
Yes, and we'll return it.
What does that even mean, the Lord has need of it?
It's self-explanatory. Why are you being so
me? Because you all know that I'm the rule follower of the bunch. I just don't know why Jesus just didn't ask Peter to do this.
Yeah, I'm thinking the same thing.
This is so up Peter's alley. Steal the donkey, cause an uproar, that's his thing. Peter is the reason why banks chain their pens. Oh, I just don't want to go to jail. You know I hate one-ply toilet paper.
Hey, lower your voice. Look, we're just going to do what Jesus says. What's the worst that could happen?
Oh, what's the worst that can happen? What's the worst that can happen? I don't know, a cracked rib, a busted lip, the kind of name-calling that'll put you in therapy years down the road.
Stop it! Stop whining! Stop talking! Stop everything! Stop freaking out!
I don't mean to be judgy here, but someone needs to get the log out of their own eye.
You have trust issues. Serious trust issues.
Do you even know how many germs are in a jail cell, do you?
No, I don't. I'm sure it's a whole lot, okay? I don't know. And I don't know why Jesus wants us to get a donkey, and I don't know why people are gathering branches over here and lining the streets, but it just seems like there's something big is about to happen.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Go back. Why did you say I had trust issues?
Okay, let's make it about you.
What?
Think about it. Since we've been following him, we've seen him give sight to the blind. He's healed people with leprosy. He's raised people from the dead. From the dead? I can't even raise you from a nap. Hey, I think we can trust him with this donkey issue.
That's just it. I have trust issues. I see how Jesus trusts the Father. He trusts so much, even more than the ground that I'm standing on. To trust someone like that, I just can't even imagine.
Yeah. But if you're gonna trust someone, it's him, right?
Okay, all right, let's do it. We got this.
All right.
You first.
Baby steps.
Hey, when we get there and we grab said donkey, maybe I really should leave like a Benjamin.
No.
A 20 spot?
No.
A thank you card.
Stop it.
All right, I'll trust him.